Dr. Craig will now present his opening statement.
Well, good evening. I'm very grateful for the invitation to participate in tonight's debate. You may not know that I'm actually a son of Iowa myself, having been raised in Keokuk, down on the mighty Mississippi, and proud of the tall corn of Iowa. So it's good to come home. I've also known Hector Avalos professionally for many years now, and despite our disagreement on the topic of tonight's debate, I appreciate him as a gentleman and a scholar. I mention this because of what I feel I must say next. In my preparation for tonight's exchange, I watched a video of Dr. Avalos debating this same topic with Professor Rubel Shelley of Vanderbilt University. I was very disturbed by what I can only call Dr. Avalos's unprofessional conduct during that debate. The goal of academic debate is to get at the truth, not to make your opponent come away with egg on his face. But Dr. Avalos adopted several stratagems in that debate which seemed clearly designed to personally embarrass or humiliate Dr. Shelley. For example, Dr. Avalos projected a photograph of an ancient document up on the screen and turned to Dr. Shelley and asked, "Can you identify this manuscript?" Now, since there are literally thousands of Greek New Testament manuscripts comprised of thousands of pages, such a question was plainly ridiculous. It turned out to be a page from a papyrus called P66, which is housed at the University of Dublin, Ireland. When Shelley couldn't identify the manuscript, Dr. Avalos whipped out a slide of another document and said, "Well, I wouldn't expect you to be able to identify every ancient document. How about this one?" It turned out to be a papyrus called P75, which is housed at Coligny in Switzerland, but of course there was no way for Shelley to know that. Then Dr. Avalos played his trump card. "But Dr. Shelley," he said, "these are two of the documents you cite on page 139 of your book, and you can't even identify them?" What made this attempt to embarrass Dr. Shelley so egregious is that Dr. Avalos knows that unless you're a professional papyrologist working for some museum, scholars don't generally work with the original documents themselves, which are locked up in climate-controlled vaults, or even with photographs of them, but with the published texts of such documents. For example, here is a text of the Greek New Testament. It's the text based upon the finest and oldest manuscripts, including P66 and P75. And at the bottom of each page, it includes all of the most important textual variants from the different manuscripts. So you don't have to, and probably never could, go look up all of the original documents. But Dr. Avalos wasn't through yet. The papyri shown in the photos were degraded and had pieces missing from them, as one would expect. After all, they're old. So Dr. Avalos says to Dr. Shelley, "Why do you say in your book that these papyri contain a complete copy of the Gospel of John when it's obvious they don't?" This was pure grandstanding. To say that a document is a complete gospel doesn't mean that the manuscript is in perfect condition. One typically means that the manuscript includes the whole gospel from the beginning to the end, rather than just some chapters of it. In this sense, the Bodmer papyri do contain a complete Gospel of John. So Dr. Avalos was not only acting in breach of professional etiquette in trying to embarrass a colleague, but he was actually the one who was wrong, and Dr. Shelley was right. But of course, all this was lost on an untrained audience of impressionable undergraduates. Now, I say all of this simply to preempt any such strategy being employed in tonight's debate. We want to focus on the evidence, not on people. I hope, Hector, that we can agree to conduct our discussion tonight according to the rules of professional etiquette and decorum that we would exercise if we were speaking, say, at a meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature. And in that way, I think we can help to ensure a profitable discussion this evening. Now, the question before us tonight is the resurrection of Jesus, fact or fiction. Notice that these are not the only two alternatives, but rather represent two extremes. In between these is the alternative that we don't know on the basis of historical evidence whether the resurrection is fact or fiction. Now, this is a position entirely compatible with the Christian faith. For centuries, and even today, the vast majority of Christians have not based their faith in Jesus' resurrection on historical evidences, but rather on a personal encounter with the living Lord himself. The resurrection may be a fact, even if we cannot prove that it happened. Now, what this implies is that if Dr. Avalos is to show that the resurrection of Jesus is a fiction, he must do more than just refute the evidence for the resurrection. Rather, he must give evidence against the resurrection. He must show either that the alleged events did not really happen, or else provide some better explanation of them. And thus we both have a burden of proof to bear in tonight's debate. Accordingly, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. First, there are four established facts about Jesus: his burial, the discovery of his empty tomb, his post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief in his resurrection. And secondly, the best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. Let's look at that first contention together. I want to share four facts which are widely accepted by New Testament historians today. Fact number one: after his crucifixion, Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. Scholars have established the fact of Jesus' burial on the basis of the following evidence. One, Jesus' burial is attested in the very old information handed on by Paul in his first letter to the Corinthians. Paul writes, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accord with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised the third day in accord with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. This old information has been dated to within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion. The second line refers to Jesus' burial. Comparison of this four-line formula with the gospel narratives on the one hand and with the sermons in the book of Acts on the other hand reveals that the second line is a summary in outline form of the story of Jesus' burial by Joseph in the tomb. 2. The burial story is part of very old source material used by Mark in writing his gospel. Since Mark is the earliest of the four Gospels, his source material goes back even closer to the events of Jesus' life. We thus have very early, independent attestation of the burial in both Mark and Paul. 3. As a member of the Jewish court that condemned Jesus, Joseph of Arimathea is unlikely to be a Christian invention. There was an understandable hostility in the early Christian church toward the Jewish leaders, who, in Christian eyes, had engineered a judicial murder of Jesus. And thus, according to the late New Testament scholar Raymond Brown, Jesus' burial by Joseph is very probable, since it would be almost inexplicable that Christians would invent a Jewish Sanhedrist who does what is right for Jesus. 4. The burial story lacks any signs of legendary development. Even Rudolf Bultmann, one of the most skeptical scholars of the past century, declared, "This is an historical account which creates no impression of being a legend apart from the women witnesses." The eminent scholar of the book of Mark, Vincent Taylor, says that even Bultmann's assessment is a notable understatement. The narrative belongs to the best tradition. 5. No other competing burial story exists. If the story of Jesus' burial were a legendary fiction which arose much later than the original event, then it's strange that we have no traces at all of the real account or even competing legendary stories. The unanimity of the burial traditions speaks in favor of their reliability. For these and other reasons, the majority of New Testament critics concur that Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea in a tomb. According to the late John A.T. Robinson of Cambridge University, the burial of Jesus in the tomb is one of the earliest and best attested facts about Jesus. Fact number 2. On the Sunday after his crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers. Among the reasons that have led most scholars to this conclusion are the following.